You're muted.
It always does that, but thanks for letting me know. All right, well, long story short, I guess if you're online, you missed that whole talk, but long story short, the virtual lab or this week's lab is virtual. We will not be meeting unless you want to, in which case email me and I'll be here for you. Otherwise, I'm going to be online during lab to help you. Yeah, and if you have questions, because a lot of people did mess up the pre-lab, I'll say mess up, you still got pretty good grades even when you miss the questions. But if you need help with the pre-lab or the lab, let me know. So I guess that's it. Any questions about anything?
Is the class gonna be online too?
Wednesday?
Yeah.
No, I'll be here. Yeah, I'll be here Wednesday, yeah. I will be here. All right, well, if there's no questions, let's get into it. Might be a short day. Let's see here. First word for attendance will be closer. Or I guess if you pronounce that differently, closer. But in that context, it is closer. Anyway, we left off talking about natural selection. We got a little bit deeper into it. We talked about exactly what it means. You know, when we say fitness, the term fitness in the context of evolution. So you learn that. You learn how the term survival of the fittest isn't quite accurate because it's not just about survival. It's also about passing on your genes, right? So if you don't procreate, then it doesn't matter how fit you are. Furthermore, if you do procreate, if you're not passing in down the genes that helped you survive and procreate, then also it doesn't matter, right? It has to be hereditary and you have to procreate. Then we talked about the three general outcomes of natural selection. So you should definitely know the difference between disruptive selection, stabilizing selection, and directional selection. And now finally, we're going to talk about sexual selection, which is a type of natural selection. And I used an example last week, and then Kesterson wrote a paper about it, or sent in a paper about it, about the blue-footed boobies. And like I said, the reason that was a good example, even though we didn't talk about it under natural selection, is because there's no advantage to having blue feet, right? Blue feet does not give a survival advantage. But the way sexual selection works, at least in that case, and a lot of other cases, is those birds have to be healthy to have those bright blue feet, right? So when a female booby sees those bright blue feet, they're not thinking, oh, well, that's a healthy specimen, but that's what's going on subconsciously, right? There's bright blue feet. That's what they're attracted to, and that is also something that helps them survive, which is a good independent work topic. And hopefully, at least this one might be entertaining for you. Think about something that you're sexually attracted to and see if there's an evolutionary reason for it. Like if you're a male and you like hips, is there a reason that a lot of men like hips? Is there a reason a lot of men like breasts? Or whatever it is you might be into. That might be a little bit personal, but hopefully that makes it more entertaining for you. Anyway, let's talk about sexual selection. Sexual selection. All right, individuals with certain traits are more likely than others to obtain mates. That's basically what sexual selection means, right? There's two different types. I might ask you to differentiate between the two on the exam. There's intra-sexual competition, and then there's intersexual selection of mates. And hopefully those two bullet points just make sense to you. It's in the name. Intra-sexual competition would be two of the same species of the same sex competing for a mate. Usually it's males competing for females. You can look that up too for independent work. Why is that usually the case in the animal kingdom? It's almost always the males competing for the females. Actually, you could probably guess that and figure it out before you even look it up. But think about it, and if you want to, look it up for independent work. Anyway, then there's intersexual selection of mates, and again, that's what we've been talking about earlier, and that is when one member of the opposite sex is choosy about what they choose, and again, or choosy about who they mate with. And again, usually that's females doing the choosing in the animal kingdom. Anyway, any questions about those two bullet points? All right, the next thing you need to know is something called sexual dimorphism. And this is the distinction in appearance between males and females. So when you can look at a species and see, oh, yeah, that's a female, or that's a male, that is sexual dimorphism. Now, obviously, sometimes they always have some sort of differences, right? You can look at a dog and look at the genitalia and tell if it's a male or female. But other than that, you generally can't tell if a dog is a male or a female, right? Well, without looking at the genitalia. But think about things like birds. Cardinals, those bright red birds, when they're bright red like that, those are the males. When they're kind of dull and I won't say gray, they're kind of orangish color, without much color, that would be a female, right? That is a great example of sexual dimorphism. And again, a great independent work topic. Just think about, give me some other examples of sexual dimorphism. The thing about sexual dimorphism is it's not directly associated with reproduction or survival. Again, using the blue-footed booby as an example, right? There is no advantage as far as survival goes to having blue feet. There's no advantage as far as reproduction goes to having blue feet, other than the fact that it's getting the mates, right? So again, that's a great example of sexual dimorphism. If you download this PowerPoint, you can click right here on that link, and there's a little YouTube video you can watch about evolution that talks about sexual selection. Any questions about this slide before we move forward and talk a little bit more about sexual selection? All right. For some species, they have secondary sex structures, which are used to compete with members of the same sex. Secondary sex structures, so you need to be aware of that. Obviously, when we mean secondary, that means we're not talking about the primary sex structures, right? So we're not talking about a penis or a vagina. We're talking about secondary sex structures. And this picture is a great example of peacock. Those are male peacocks, right? They've got those big old tails, right? That is a secondary sex structure. It's there to attract females. In this particular case, that is for this second bullet point right here, right? It is used for ritualized displays. Then again, going back to this first bullet point, sometimes it involves combat, right? So you might have sheep, for example. There'll be a picture on the next slide where I show you some sheep where they're fighting, they're headbutting, right? Or because they are competing for a mate. More commonly, individuals of one sex, and it's usually the females, are choosy in selecting mates. Now, I honestly don't remember if I'm going to tell you this or not. So again, assuming I don't get to it later in this PowerPoint, slides, that was a good independent work topic. And it should be, if you think about it, you should be able to figure out why is it the females who are usually choosy and not the males. Think about it, write down your hypothesis, look it up, and see if you're correct or not. And again, that's assuming I don't actually have the answer on this PowerPoint. So again, pictures as an example. Sexual dimorphism, right? So here's a male bird, here's a female bird, right? Same species, but the male is a lot more colorful. And of course, here we have these two males competing. They're in combat, right? Of course, those are just examples. Are there any questions about sexual selection? All right. So once again, this PowerPoint is from the old textbook. So it includes things that are in the old textbook that are not in your textbook. So I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to go past this, but you could read it if you want. I'm not going to ask any questions about it. But it's a great example of, a good topic that's related to evolution. And I brought this up when we first started this chapter, when I was talking about how when you take antibiotics and they say, take it for the full 10 days, you have to do it for the full 10 days because that's basically what this is talking about, where once you start taking antibiotics and you start feeling better, that's because you killed most of the bacteria. But you didn't kill all of them, right? You feel better because most of them are dead, but some of them are still alive. Now you killed off the weakest ones and the strongest ones are still alive. Therefore, if you stop taking it, then those stronger ones are going to come back. And those are the ones who are a little bit more resistant to the antibiotics. So then you have these bacteria who are immune to antibiotics. Anyway, again, I'm not going to ask any questions about that. You can read about it if you want. Oh, wow, that's it. All right, let me pull up the next chapter. While I'm doing that, if anybody has any questions, let me know.
What were the other two types of selection?
The two different, What do you need? I'm sorry.
There's sexual selection and two other ones that you said we should already know about.
Natural selection, sexual selection, then there was other types of evolution. So there was genetic drift, gene flow.
I think she's talking about the intra and the,
Oh, intrasexual versus, no. Well, yeah, the different types of evolution, you definitely need to know that. So it's gene flow, natural selection, obviously, technically artificial selection. What did I say, gene flow?
Is gene flow and gene drift the same thing?
Genetic drift, good question, because it sounds like it would be, right? But no, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's an important topic. And I'll try to explain it as I'm pulling up this next PowerPoint. Gene flow is literally when genes are flowing because individuals are migrating, either coming into a population and or moving out of a population. Genetic drift is when things change, but it's completely by chance. So the example that we gave on the PowerPoint was, sorry, I'm trying to talk to you and you pull this up at the same time. The example we gave on this PowerPoint slide was those population of flowers, right? There was some red ones, there were some white ones. There was no advantage to being either one of those colors. There was no disadvantage to being either one of those colors. And by chance, they showed 3 generations of those flowers, and by chance, these are the ones that reproduced in the first generation. And then by chance, these are the ones that reproduced in the second generation. And by the time we got to the third generation, they were all, I think, red flowers. And again, not because it was advantageous to be red or disadvantageous to be white. It's by chance. So yes, genetic drift is by chance, and gene flow is all about individuals migrating. Good question. Let's see, chapter 19. Yep. All right. Any other questions while I'm pulling this up? All right. So now we're skipping, notice, all the way to chapter 19. So everything between chapter 12 and chapter 19, we're not going to cover. You can if you want. You know, I obviously always recommend reading it, but none of that stuff is going to be on the exam. Some of you have had my Bio 108 class, and starting here, moving forward, this is basically like a introduction to the 108 class. So if you've had my 108 class, a lot of this is going to be reviewed for you. Just like today's or this week's lab. If you've had my 108 class, you've had a version of this week's lab. Of course, they're always different. I always change them up a little bit. All right, here we go. Almost have it downloaded. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, good.
The free lab,
Mhm.
if we didn't get a low enough score to like fail in your lab, or I mean, like, if I fail all of them, do I have to redo them?
I guess you don't have to. So the question, in case you didn't hear on lab, is basically how the free lab is going to work. So for the free lab, you just tell me, say, hey, this is my, choose a lab that you've already done and tell me, use this as my grade for this week's lab. But the idea here is, though, in theory, I would hope, you don't have to do this, but the idea would be for you to take the lowest lab that you had and redo it and say, this is the grade, this is the lab that I want to be my grade, but I want to redo it. So in a sense, it's kind of like you're getting a choice of, hey, I've got a lot of stuff going on, I don't want to do another lab, so choose this one because it's my highest grade. Or you can hopefully fix one of your old grades. So your choice. Yeah, good question. And I don't know if I'm going to meet, if we're going to meet or not. That'll be up to you. If you guys want to meet, I can be here for you, just like this week. Otherwise, I have no plans on doing that. All right. Getting there. Where are we at here? Downloads. Here we go, chapter 19. Sorry for the wait. To me, this is more fun. This is the stuff I love about biology. Even though I got my master's in basically genetics, is what I was dealing with. This is the stuff I love. I love when I think about biology, I think about how organisms interact with each other and how they interact with the environment. To me, that's biology. I mean, granted, everything we've been talking about so far is biology, but now finally we are moving past talking about individuals. Well, I guess evolution is obviously not about individuals, that's about populations, but now we're talking about even bigger stuff. And again, for me, this is my favorite part of the course. So here we go. We're going to talk about in chapter 19, population and community ecology. You already know what a population is. I'm about to teach you what a community is, and I'm about to teach you what ecology is. The next word for attendance will be this picture that's on the up there right now. So use, I guess it's not a word for attendance, I guess it could be a sentence for attendance. Describe this picture. Obviously, I'm doing this for a reason, because it would be awfully suspicious if two people had the same exact description, you know. Anyway, yeah, so whatever, I guess you could use one word if you want, but you could use one word or a sentence, whatever it is, but describe that picture. That's the second word for attendance. All right, here we go. Once again, this PowerPoint is kind of taken from the old textbook. I didn't do much editing, because again, I think the older textbook did a better job of these later chapters. So I kept it mostly in the same order. And again, the old textbook, at the beginning of every chapter, had these pictures. We had to kind of guess what these pictures have to do with this chapter, and also what this chapter has to do with your everyday life. So can anybody tell what this picture is up here on the top left? What's going on up there? Fishing, yeah. Big time fishing too, like commercial fishing, not just some guy with a rod and reel riding down our lake, right? This is commercial fishing. So what you're going to learn about in this chapter is how population ecology can be applied to commercial fishing, because somebody has to set the rules for these people, right? Somebody decides, all right, you can go fishing, you can catch these fish, but you can only catch this many. You have to do it from, between these months and these months. They have to be this big before otherwise you have to throw it back, right? There's a lot of rules. And what you're going to learn in this chapter, obviously we're not going to go that deep, but the basics, you're going to learn the basics about kind of why people have these rules and how they set those rules and how they decide what those rules should be. What about the picture next to that, the top right?
Trash.
Yeah, trash, right? That's a landfill, excuse me. And you're going to learn again about, when we talk about population ecology, as you should already know from doing the pre-lab for this week's lab, we're going to talk about how we have to absorb waste, right? So waste is one of the things we have to deal with. And again, we're going to learn more about that in this chapter. Bottom left is a long line of people. Actually, I'm trying to remember what that was supposed to signify. Let me look at this. Population part 1, population part 2. Oh yeah. So the old textbook said, and this is back in 2016, one person per second. Okay. If you were to count the human population, this is way back in 2016, and you were to count one person per second, it would take more than 22 years to count humans. Oh, there's a good independent work question for you. Just basic math, if you want to look that up. Again, that was in 2016. Now the human population is over 8 billion, so you can look that up. How long, if you were to count the human population one at a time, how long would it take to count everybody? And again, that's going to require you to look up the exact population, which I know is over 8 billion. I just don't know exactly what it is, and then do the math to figure out how long that would take. And then we have some elephants on the bottom right, and again, I need to remind myself what this is. Oh yeah, so obviously, the world's not filled with elephants, but the old textbook points out that given an unlimited resources, one pair of elephants could turn into 19 million elephants in 750 years. Obviously, elephants have been around longer than 750 years, and obviously their population is not that large, right? So why not? What's keeping them from their population from getting so large? Not that it matters. Like, elephants are, as far as this course is concerned, they're not like anything special. That's just an example that the old textbook used. The point being, populations don't just grow and grow and grow and grow. Humans are for now. But generally speaking, in nature, that doesn't happen, right? Something stops populations from growing and growing. And that's what you're going to learn about in this chapter. What keeps populations level? All right, any questions about this slide? All right, so once again, this being a PowerPoint from the old textbook, The old textbook also has these things at the beginning of every chapter called biology and society. So it gives like a relatively recent news story that is relevant to your everyday life. I'm going to skip it. You can read about it. It's about invasive species. The particular one in this case is called lionfish. I like this example too because I'm from Florida, well, Florida and Georgia, but I grew up some of my time in the Keys. So for me, I was very familiar with this. This was a big deal, not a big deal, but in the Keys, we all know about these invasive species. And Kesterson's already written a paper about one. There's carp. And after this chapter, you could take that topic you used, Kesterson, and redo it. Okay. Because this is the chapter that that topic will be perfect for.
That deals with the population.
Exactly. Yeah. So here we go. An overview of population ecology. First of all, once again, you need to know what a population is. Okay. And I've already given you the definition. Here's the definition again. But now, of course, sometimes these things change from chapter to chapter. So in the context of this chapter, the definition is a population is a group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same area at the same time. Right? So for example, all the squirrels on WVSU's campus would be a population. Of course, not just the campus too, the surrounding area. Someone online, if you could, you might want to mute yourself. You probably are accidentally unmuted, which doesn't bother me too much, but you never know, you could get embarrassed depending on what happens on your end. But anyway, that's what a population is. You definitely need to know what a population is. Later in this chapter, in the next chapter, we're going to take it up a step, and you're going to need to know what's bigger than a population. Then we're going to take it up another step. So you're going to need to know the differences between these two terms. Right now, this is pretty easy because it's the only one I've given you, population. But again, later, you're going to learn some other terms, and you're going to need to know the difference between them. So individuals in a population rely on the same resources. So again, like the squirrels at WVSU's campus, they're relying on the same resources, right? If for some reason the university burnt down and all the trees burnt down with it, right? All those squirrels would be in trouble because that's where they live. That's where they get their food, right? They're relying on the same resources. They're influenced by the same environmental factors. So again, I don't know, if we were to have some kind of weird freeze, some kind of blizzard, some mini ice age here in West Virginia, then all the squirrels in this area, just using that as an example, would be dealing with that same environment, that same climate issue. Meanwhile, maybe squirrels over in Washington State, for example, not dealing with the same thing, right? So they're different populations. And finally, they are likely to interact and breed with one another, right? So when they're in the same population, that means a lot of things, right? So when we talk about interact, that means sometimes they might be helping each other. They're definitely competing for the same resources, right? Yeah, and of course, the breeding, that kind of takes care of itself. Any questions about this slide? Definitely need to know what a population is.
Aren't we afraid that inbreeding will happen because of this? Would there be a lot of inbreeding where they come out with deformed
Great question.
species?
And that depends on the population size and also how much gene flow there is with that population. Right? So it completely depends on the population. Good question. So if there's a really small, isolated population, like the Amish that you wrote about,
Yeah.
right? That would be, they do have an issue with inbreeding because they're a relatively small population. They're culturally isolated, right? And therefore there's not a lot of genes coming in, right? There's not a lot of, they're not making the gene pool any deeper. But yes, to answer your question, inbreeding is always an issue with populations. But again, the bigger the population, the less you have to worry about that. And the more gene flow, the less you have to worry about that.
Do animals have mental problems and stuff like that from inbreeding like humans do?
They would, yeah. Now, what I don't know though, is this is such a great topic, and I'm interested now too. You can look it up. The different species, different populations is probably more prevalent than the other, and I don't know. Like I said, my work was in genetics, but it was in plants. So I'm curious, yeah. That's a good topic to look up. I bet there must be some populations of certain animals where there is a lot of inbreeding. And it will be detrimental. But the question is, how much? And again, that depends on the population and the species. Which is also interesting, because think about plants. Plants can fertilize themselves, right? So plants don't really have to worry too much about inbreeding. If you can fertilize yourself, then I mean, that's the most inbred you can get, right?
Yeah.
But for plants, that's not an issue. So it's interesting how it is an issue with animals. But yeah, good question. So you can look that up. And later in this chapter, or maybe it's the next chapter, I'm going to introduce you to a term called endemic species, which are species that are only found in one spot on Earth. So I would guess, to answer your question a little bit more, those endemic species will probably have more issues than other species because, again, they're like a small population and they're only in that one spot on Earth. So I would imagine there would be more inbreeding. So, any questions about what population is? All right, now that you know what a population is, now we can talk about what population ecology is, which is what this whole chapter is about. Population ecology is concerned with the changes in a population size and the factors that regulate populations over time. So population ecology is looking at the population size and how it's different, how it changes. That's the one thing you're looking at, right? How's the population changing? And the other half of that is what's making it change that way? What's making the population increase or decrease or stay the same? That's what population ecology is. So to study this, we're obviously going to be studying populations, but we have different ways of studying populations, and you need to know these. First one is the size. I think most people know that. When you talk about a population, that's usually what people talk about. Earlier in this lecture, I said there's over 8 billion humans on Earth, right? So that was population size. Another thing is age structure. So and also, by the way, these are great independent work topics. Choose a place and give me all the answers to this, right? So if you want to, what's the population of humans in West Virginia, right? That would be the size. Age structure, right? So for example, and you could look this up and give me the exact answers, but I think per capita, West Virginia has more older people than a lot of other states. So that would be age structure, right? We've got more older people per capita than younger people. Then there's density, and again, you could look this up for independent work as well. You know, how many individuals, not just how many individuals, but how many individuals in a certain spot. So yeah, those are the three things you need to know. Those are three ways we describe a population: the size, the age structure, and the density. And of course, I'm using humans as an example, but in a way, it's not really a great example because humans are so weird, right? We're kind of in control of our own population. No other species has the control that we do. So maybe I should stop using humans as an example, but yeah. So think about these three things, and you can look that up for independent work if you want. Choose a place, and you know, what is the population size, what is the age structure, and what is the density? Choose a place and look it up. And if you really want to, I guess you could also go past humans, speaking of which, like not just the size, age structure, and density of humans in wherever place, but any other species you're interested in. Anyway, if you download this PowerPoint and click that link, there's a 12-minute video that you can watch on population ecology. I highly recommend it. Here's some pictures from the old textbook. These are people doing population ecology work. Here we have somebody who's tranquilized a bear, and looks like she's given it a radio collar. Here you've got somebody researching meerkats in the bottom right, and here at the top right, you have somebody collecting data on a puffin. Of course, again, those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. All right, next concept you need to be familiar with is something called population dynamics. These are the interactions between the biotic and abiotic factors that cause the variation of population size. Like I said earlier, population ecology is all about, studying this population size, how it's changing, and what's causing it to change, right? So that's what population dynamics is then. That whole part where what's causing it to change, that's this. So in a sense, now that you know this, I could go back and rewrite this and say, population ecology is concerned with population changes and population size, and instead of saying factors that regulate populations over time, you could just say, and population dynamics. Population dynamics are the factors that regulate populations over time. Now we're just getting more specific, and I'm saying it's the biotic and abiotic factors that are causing this variation that are in the population size. And what that means is the living and non-living factors, right? So for example, I'm sure the, population of gazelles in Africa, they're probably maxed out, whatever the number is. They probably don't get much higher than that. They've probably maxed out because of biotic factors. Like, first of all, if there was any more of them, they would probably run out of food. Probably wouldn't have enough water to drink. Also, you've got lions and other things eating them, right? So the larger they get, the more the lions get to eat. So those are the biotic factors. Abiotic factors would be things like the climate. Again, using those gazelles as an example, if there was some really bad drought that lasted a decade in sub-Saharan Africa, that would kill off a lot of things, right? That would change the population size. It would kill them, so that would be an abiotic factor. So there's living and non-living things that affect the population. That's what we're talking about for population dynamics.
Would pollution be one?
Yes, pollution's a big one, yes. Pollution is an abiotic factor, which is very relevant if we're talking about humans, and we're talking about West Virginia, that is relevant to us. If you want to scare yourself, look up cancer rates in this area versus in other areas.
Well, that's because of DuPont.
Yep. Specifically, I hate to say this, but the area we're at is even worse, for example, than Cross Lane.
And North Charleston has been known for being cancer causing.
Yep. And that's why I work from home a lot.
That's why I moved to Chesapeake.
There you go. But anyway, so those are population dynamics. An important aspect of population dynamics is population growth, right? So we're very interested in how populations grow, especially with humans, because for us, that's a very relevant topic, right? Population growth has its issues for sure. It's generally speaking, as far as the environment is concerned, a bad thing. But we'll talk more about that later. And speaking of which, here's a little graph. Yeah. And I forgot when this was made. Is it on there? I forgot when this graph was made, but it turned out to be correct because it was, well, it was close. So we hit 8 billion last year, if I remember correctly. It was 2023 when we hit, I think. It definitely wasn't this year. It was definitely prior to this year. So we actually hit 8 billion quicker than we thought we were going to. But pretty close. Anyway, those are population dynamics. Are there any questions about what population dynamics are? All right, so for the next slide, this is more like, why does this even matter? And this is what this is answering. Population ecology plays a key role in applied research, which for you guys, it probably doesn't matter, right? You guys aren't biologists. As far as I know, you don't plan to be biologists, but this is still part of everyday life. Population ecology provides information for conservation and restoration projects, which is why I included this picture. Does anybody know what that's a picture of? Not like exactly where, but what is that a picture of?
A strip mining community?
Strip mining, yeah, mountaintop removal, right? So, and I'm not gonna, we'll talk later about the pros and cons of strip mining a little bit, but more importantly, in the context of this bullet point, these coal mining companies can't just do what they want willy-nilly, right? There's rules and regulations. So somebody has set up regulations like, all right, once you do this strip mining and this mountaintop removal, then when you're done with it, you have to do this to the land. Right? So somebody has rules and has told them what they need to do to restore it. But you have to know population ecology to do that properly. It's not like someone just says, all right, when you're done, make sure you put some soil down and put a bunch of grass seed, right? It's not that easy, right? Somebody has to know the populations, the ecology around here and set up like, all right, first you need to put this species here, and you need to restore this the way it was, and this way and that way, right? So there's a lot of rules. And again, population ecology sets those regulations, not sets the regulations, but guides us for other people to set those regulations.
Well, there's even water runoff rules and regulations.
Yeah, and that's a huge deal too, and we'll talk about that later.
Even the highway department has rules about how they make their ditches and stuff.
Yep, yeah, and that's a great example. And in that case, you could almost put that under the conservation category.
Yeah.
You might not think of it, but yeah, like you said, there's rules to how they have to build highways, and that's one of them because they're trying to conserve the ecology, right? They're trying to make sure things aren't getting too much worse. The least impact, the better. It's also used to develop fisheries. This is kind of big in West Virginia, right? So if you like to go fishing, and a lot of times people complain about having to pay for a fishing license, but this is one of the reasons why. Because there's people who have to study population ecology, who are setting up those rules. You say, all right, you can only catch them from here to here. They have to be this big. You know, there's rules for a reason. And these people study this because they study population ecology. They know how it should be. So somebody has to pay for that, right? And it makes sense for the people who are doing the fishing to be paying for that. Hence, fishing license. Likewise, it's also used to develop and manage wildlife populations. In a sense, these two bullet points are almost the same. This one is really specific and talking about fish. The other one's less specific and think about things like, again, hunting, right? So deer and bear, things like that. There's rules that people have figured out, right? And that's why, because people have studied the ecology. That's why we have these rules. And then finally, population ecology provides insight into controlling how pests and pathogens spread. Going back to Kesterson's paper that he wrote about those Asian carps, right? They are pests. They are an invasive species. So population ecology provides insights on how those things are spreading. And like your paper said, how we can control or try to control it. All right, so the next word for attendance, and then I'll take a question, is this picture on the bottom right.
The elk,
You tell me.
looks like an elk to me.
Whatever you want to say it is, that's your word for attendance.
This slide that your bulletin right there, it says used to manage wildlife .s. What is that? .s. What's going
Oh,
on?
you know what? That should be a .s. That should be like apostrophe.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
just trying to shorten. Used to manage wildlife populations.
Okay, that had me confused.
I'm glad you asked.
I thought you had mathematical equations.
Oh, I'm glad you asked. No, that's it. Yeah. So that second to last bullet point should say used to manage wildlife populations. Anyway, any questions from this slide? Let's move forward. Like I said, there's different ways of studying population ecology. One of the things we look at is population density. That's what we're about to look at. Population density. Let's talk about population density. Population density, the definition is the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume of the habitat. So for humans, we're very familiar with that, right? We might say, oh yeah, there's 1,000 humans per square mile, right? But then you also have to think about things like fish. This is the example I'm giving, and of course, these are just examples, so don't memorize any of this. But you could say, how many largemouth bass per cubic kilometer, right? So you don't want to do square miles like you might with humans, because that's more three-dimensional, right? Large, when we're talking about lakes or water, that's three-dimensional. So there you're looking at cubic kilometers. Oak trees per square kilometer in the forest. Nematodes per cubic meter in a forest soil. And of course, like the example I already gave, humans per square mile. And if you download the PowerPoint, you can click on that, and it will give you a short little video about population density for humans. Any questions about this slide? Once again, and I'm going to put an X to this to visually drive this point home. Those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you anything about largemouth bass or nematodes or oak trees. Actually, there might be a question about oak trees. That's not about oak trees, but there might be a question, and oak trees might be one of the examples in the question, but you don't need to know anything specific about oak trees to answer that question. All right, so then the question is, how do we measure population density? How do we measure population size at all? For humans, it's easy, right? Because we keep track. When a human is born, generally speaking, we know about it. They're in the system. When a human dies, generally speaking, we know about it, right? Plus then you have census, right? So not only do we keep track of who's born and who dies, we also keep track, generally speaking, of who moves in and out of an area. Not only do we have that, but then every 4 years we have a census where people go out and like literally collect population information from humans. But again, like I said earlier, humans are not the best example because we are the exception to the rule. So in most cases, if you're trying to measure the population size, it's very impractical or sometimes impossible to count all the individuals in a population. For example, going back to this other slide right here, I bet if you were to look it up, somewhere, somebody probably knows how many oak trees per square kilometer are in the Kanawha State Forest. I bet someone knows that. And I bet you can find that answer online. And I also bet whoever figured that out didn't go to Kanawha State Forest and go through the whole thing and count every single tree. There's methods, and we won't even get into the specific methods, but there's different methods that we use to estimate the population size of different populations. Because again, it's not practical to go count every individual. So, some examples that we use, and again, these are just examples, so you don't need to necessarily memorize any of these, but somebody might count the number of birds' nests, right? So, somebody who studied a particular species of birds probably knows if they see a particular nest, like, all right, if there's a nest there, there's probably X many, however many birds usually live in that nest, right? So then they could just estimate that based on the number of birds' nests they found in a certain area. And then they could extrapolate that data and say, all right, well, there's probably this many birds in the United States, for example. And again, some probably doesn't know that. I bet if you look up, choose a bird species, I bet if you look it up, you can find out how many they think there are on the earth. Not because someone went out and counted every single cardinal, for example, but they're estimates. And that, again, bird's nest is just one of those examples of one of the ways they can estimate. Rodent burrows, right? So again, if somebody's studying a particular type of rodent, they know typically how many rodents live in a particular burrow. So they can count the number of burrows and then say, all right, well, probably there's X many rodents, because this is how many generally live in a particular burrow. Termite mounds, same thing. Somebody who studies termites can probably tell you, once they see a termite mound, based on the size of it, they can probably figure out how many termites probably are living in that termite mound. Anyway, the examples go on and on. And speaking of which, that's another good independent work topic. Those are some examples I gave you. What are some other ways that people measure population? So those are 3 examples that I gave you. You can look up other ones for independent work. And again, you can just do it for one point where you don't write a paper. You just said, I looked it up, and here's a way. And then you give me your source, right? If you want to, you can write a paper about it. But again, nice and easy for one point. Just send me an email and say, I looked it up, and according to this source, this is another way that scientists measure population. Any questions about that slide? All right, here's a picture that goes along with that slide. So there's a bunch of groundhogs. And again, whoever studies these can tell you, like when they see a burrow, they probably know, generally speaking, if you see a hole in the ground, there's there's a family of 5 that live in there. Of course, I'm just making that number up, I don't know it. But someone does, whoever studies these things knows those kind of things. All right, so that's population density. Next, we'll talk about population age structure. Age structure of a population is the distribution of individuals in different age groups. So again, using humans as an example, like I said, I think, and I'm almost positive on this, I think West Virginia has a higher percentage of older people per capita than most other states, using that as an example. But again, humans are bad examples because we are usually the exception to the rule. So let's talk about it from more of a nature perspective. Age structure provides an insight into a history of a population's survival, and I'll give you a good example for that on the next slide. It also provides insight into reproductive success. Again, on the next slide would be a good example. And how the population relates to environmental factors. Again, give you an example on the next slide. But are there any questions about this slide? All right, so again, for a human, age structure is important because we need to think about things like, when you think about the government and where our tax money is going, age structure is important for that reason, right? So, if you have more older people than younger people, then you're probably more worried about health infrastructure than you are about, K through 12 education, for example. But when we're talking about other stuff, nature, it's a little bit different. So let's use this as an example. This is not from your textbook, this is from an old textbook. If somebody were to be studying this particular species of birds, right, they just started the study, And they're going around, they're collecting birds, and they figure out how old they are, and then they come up with this graph, right? So they haven't been there, they just started this study, they haven't been there 11 years. But again, they're collecting birds, they're collecting specimens, they're estimating how old they are, and they make this graph. This is the age structure, right? So we can see that there's less than 10 that are 1 year old. There was none that were 2 or 3 years old. There was a lot of them that were, 4 years old, fewer that were 5, so on and so forth, right? So this actually provides insights. They can look at this population size and then look at historical data and say, all right, well, what happened 2 years ago? What happened 3 years ago? And they can maybe look at, climate factors, for example. And they might figure out from that information, from looking at what happened 2 and 3 and 10 years ago, they might be able to figure out, oh, wow, these birds are very susceptible to drought, for example. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there. But by just now starting to look at this population and looking at the age structure, they can get information, right? They can make these informed decisions. They can figure things out as if they've been there for 11 years, doing the study for 11 years. Also, you can look at what happens, all right, well, what happened 4 years ago? Because that population exploded 4 years ago and then crashed. I won't say crashed, but we got a lot lower, right? So they can look at things like what happened in that area 4 years ago. Hope that makes sense. Point being, when population ecologists are studying a population, this is how they can do it, right? They can take measurements, they can figure out the population age structure, and then from there start figuring out, things that are good or bad for a population. Any questions about that slide? I put a big old X through here, reminding you that's just an example. There'll be no questions about that. We have less than a minute, so we're not going to jump into this next one. But the last word for attendance will be curves. And that's it. I'm going to go down to my office and do office hours. So if you need me, that's where I'll be.
How many questions are gonna be on our line?
Good question, great question. If you're online and didn't hear that, she asked how many questions will be on the final, and there should be about 100. So about 50 of them are gonna come verbatim from the first 3 exams. Like I didn't reword them, they're just copied and pasted. And then about 50 of them are coming from these last portions, like the chapters that we're covering right now. So you'll have about 100 minutes to answer 100 questions. And as always, if you want more time, all we have to do is meet in person. So I can assure, or online, I mean, so I can assure that you are taking a closed book exam, in which case, I don't care how long it takes you. Take all the time in the world if I know it's a closed book.
Are we gonna have the opportunity to meet with you for the 5%?
Yeah, so the other question, in case you didn't hear that, and this is also a good reminder, and so far, if I remember correctly, she's the only person who's ever taken me up on this. But if you meet me online, I will go over an old exam with you, give you all the correct answers, which you'll need because you need to study that for the final. And in addition to that, you'll get a 5% boost to your grade for allowing me to give you feedback. So that also stands for the final, yes. After you're done with the final, I can meet with you and give you all the correct answers and talk about why they're correct and all that stuff.
And my last question is, since I'm probably not gonna do free lab, is it gonna affect my grades or something we can do in an alternative or?
Nope, you just choose which grade. You just send me an email, say, I want my grade to be the grade from this lab. That'll be it. And I'll put it in the, yeah. Yep.